The interests of farmers clash with that of the government. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. The Financial Post put out an article titled "Crop Yields Will Suffer. Fertilizer reduction targets are pitting farmers against the federal government." And it's important that we address the facts of the case here. So, first of all, the federal government put out a plan to mandate that Canadian agricultural businesses reduce their use of nitrogen fertilizer. Why? That's in order to lower greenhouse gas emissions. Now, to be clear, this is a plan to mandate, not a mandate just yet, but even given that, there's been massive pushback from business and agricultural groups who argue that this change will reduce crop yields at a time when food insecurity is a major concern. The timing is very poor. So, Agriculture Canada maintains that reducing nitrous oxide emissions associated with these synthetic nitrogen fertilizers is necessary, and it must be done to achieve the government's goal of net zero by 2050. Now, to go down this path, there is a key milestone that they are suggesting. Whatever the levels of usage of the fertilizer was in 2020, they want to be 30% below that by 2030. So quite a large reduction in a short span of time. Now, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business came out against the proposal last week, and they want to ensure that emission targets for farmers remain voluntary. They don't like the term mandate. They don't want farmers to be forced to do this, and there are a couple reasons why that we'll get into. First of all, there are obviously business concerns. They're worried about their bottom line. But the average Canadian may get worried too about the food on their plate and what it could mean for us if we go down this path. The basic equation here is the fertilizers allow the crop yields to grow exponentially. There is more food and it's of a higher quality. Now, if you take away the tool, the fertilizer, you can perhaps still produce high quality foods, but the quantity will surely suffer. What's that going to do to price tags within Canada? Keep in mind this is our domestic farmers. The article goes on to write that nitrogen fertilizer is an essential element for farming. It drives increases in Canadian crop yields, which lead to increased grain sales and exports. So, good for us internally, and good for exporting to increase things like government revenues. The Independent Business Association that we talked about before said that in a recent survey, nearly 3/4, which turned out to be about 72% of farmers, said that crop yields and overall food production will fail if they are forced to reduce their use of nitrogen fertilizer. The group says that the move would make our Canadian farmers far less profitable and less competitive, and that really is a key point that we'll touch on in just a second, but first, I just want to outline the overall problem. It's a question of priorities, and we can clearly see them competing in real time. On one hand, you have the environment and this goal of net zero by 2050. On the other hand, you have food production. Sometimes things don't line up perfectly, and it is a matter of putting one over the other. It doesn't mean that the other has to be completely abandoned, but you have to make concessions. The trade-off before us is very clear. If we want to progress down this path of getting to net zero, we have to make cuts, and some of those cuts are going to be unpleasant. They might do things like make our farmers far less competitive, far more susceptible to international competition, make domestic food prices go up by quite a significant chunk. But you get to your net zero. Or on the other hand, you have to get more creative about how to get to net zero because this path here doesn't seem reasonable. We don't want to undermine farming. Where would you stand on that? I think the long-term implications of that question are harder to deduce, but in the short term, in the here and now, it's quite clear. We are living in a time of rapid inflation, of, as the article put it, shortages when it comes to food. To implement this mandate now seems ridiculous. Let's stabilize our production first. Let's let the world economy put itself back together. Perhaps the goal here of reducing 2020 levels by 30% in the next 10 years is too aggressive. Maybe we can do something a little bit more lenient. Perhaps we can do things as suggested where we incentivize farmers to take part in the program, but not make it a mandate. There are many things to discuss here, but at this point in time, it seems irrational to make the situation harder for Canadians to deal with. And that's certainly what's going to happen if fertilizer usage is curbed at this point in time. I find this situation to be quite interesting because it dispels some illusion that I'm finding many people are typically falling under these days, that you can have your cake and eat it too all the time. No, that's not the case. The real world is complicated, and you can have a master value. There are certain people who all they think about is climate, and I can understand why. It is important, but it can't be the only thing you think about, because then you fall victim to collateral damage. There has to be a balance, and that's the way forward. To take these competing priorities and to configure them in ways where you can get the best outcome or a better outcome than if you were to optimize entirely in one direction. If you go 100% in the climate direction, why net zero 2050? Let's do net zero 2025. Let's ban fertilizer entirely. Let's ban all cars. If you do that, you can meet your climate emission goals perhaps within the next decade. But is that reasonable? That's one pole on this balance beam. On the other side, let's do nothing. Let's use more fertilizer, more fossil fuels. Let's make the environment as bad as we can. Well, that's a terrible idea, and that's the other extreme. The path forward lies somewhere in the middle here. And maybe it's a middle that veers more toward the climate or more towards the farming in this particular case, but that's open to discussion. One thing that I believe many climate activists are forgetting is that climate change is a global phenomenon. It can't just be a Canadian thing. You can't just view it through a national lens, otherwise you're not going to do anything. Even if Canada reaches our goal of net zero by 2050, that will mean literally nothing if the rest of the planet isn't also achieving these type of results. When it comes time to balance the scales, you have to look at things strategically. If you are able to reduce Canadian fertilizer rates by something like 30%, are they going to increase by 30% or more in places like China or India, where they're going to make up the difference, where farmers over there are going to see an opportunity? Because Canadian farmers have a handicap now, and they won't produce as they could, and they can't give you the pricing that other countries could. So, is there going to be a gap now where the void is being filled, and in reality, what you've done is nothing? On the global scale, you've reduced climate change by a grand sum of zero. In Canada specifically, we've reduced our emissions, but the emissions may go up elsewhere. This is the type of thinking that I seldom see when we're talking about climate. It always has to be viewed through a global lens. There will always be consequences and reactions to our decisions here, and the same thing plays out with gas and oil. These equations are not as simple as politicians would sometimes like you to believe. Sure, if we don't tap into our natural resources, that might be good for the local Canadian environment. There'll be less oil spills, for example. But there is a global demand for oil. And if Canada is not filling that void, the market's going to get it from somewhere else. Is it better for the global climate? Is it better for the world if Saudi Arabia or Russia provide that energy need? If the answer is no, well, there's clearly a lesser of two evils equation before you then. The oil demand is going to get filled one way or the other, at least now. Long term, that might change, and I'm 100% on board with changing the habits of people, giving them incentive to shift their energy needs maybe to more electricity-based options. But that doesn't happen overnight. And we have to think about the here and now in conjunction with the long term. If you want to get holistic with the energy example, which I recommend you do, there are other things to consider even beyond just climate, like geopolitical factors. Does it make sense to funnel the global demand and further the global money circulation for that demand to countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia? Is that really the right move, or does funneling money to countries who not only pose this shared environmental risk, but in addition also pose social problems, is that the right way to go? This is something that we all have to grapple with. There is a bedrock concern that perhaps the government is prioritizing making themselves look good versus grappling with the reality on the ground. And that would obviously have disastrous outcomes. We have to be pragmatic, realistic, and both short-term and long-term thinkers when dealing with complex problems like this. Now, with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share. They'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.